Have you ever wondered how far back slavery really goes? Most of us have heard about the Atlantic slave trade, the one involving European ships and African slaves being taken to the Americas. But there's another major part of history that often gets ignored. It's older, lasted longer, and took a huge toll on the African continent. It's called the Sub-Saharan slave trade. And it didn't involve ships, it involved long desert journeys, ancient empires, and millions of lives forever changed. The Sub-Saharan slave trade is a part of African history that doesn't always make it into the classroom, but it's one of the most important things to learn if we want to understand how the world came to be the way it is today. In this countdown, we'll go through 10 powerful and eye-opening facts about the Sub-Saharan slave trade. These are stories that deserve to be told. Number 10. The Sub-Saharan slave trade began over 1,300 years ago. Long before the Atlantic slave trade began in the 1400s, the Sub-Saharan slave trade had already started. It dates all the way back to the 7th century, when Arab traders began moving southward into Africa. They didn't just come for gold or spices, they were also looking for slaves. This trade was deeply connected to the rise of Islam and the expansion of Arab influence into Africa. It wasn't a small operation either. For more than 1,000 years, people were taken from the interior of Africa and sold in markets across the Middle East and North Africa. These slave routes passed through some of the harshest environments on Earth, especially the Sahara Desert. Enslaved people often had to walk thousands of miles through heat, sandstorms, and hunger. Many didn't survive the journey. And those who did ended up living far from their homes, in cultures they didn't understand, doing work they never chose. Number 9. Millions of Africans were taken across the Sahara. Historians estimate that anywhere from 10 to 20 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the Sahara Desert during the height of the Sub-Saharan slave trade. Some estimates go even higher. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which moved people by sea, the Sub-Saharan slave trade used land routes. Huge caravans, sometimes with hundreds of camels, would carry goods and people across thousands of kilometers of desert. Slaves were chained, forced to carry goods, and often treated with extreme cruelty. Many died from thirst, exhaustion, or disease before they ever reached their destination. The death rate on these journeys was shockingly high. In some cases, it's believed that up to 2/3 of the people taken across the desert never made it out alive. Number 8. Women were the main target in this trade. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which focused mainly on men for plantation labor, the Sub-Saharan slave trade was different. It targeted women more than men. Many enslaved African women were taken to become domestic servants, concubines, or even wives in Arab households. In some places, these women became part of royal harems, or were sold in public markets. This gender imbalance had deep effects on African communities. Families were torn apart, whole villages lost their daughters and sisters, and over time, the constant removal of women from the population affected population growth and social structures in African societies. Number 7. Eunuchs were created through brutal castration. One of the most disturbing parts of the Sub-Saharan slave trade was the practice of creating eunuchs, men who had been castrated so they could serve in royal palaces, harems, or as guards. Many young boys taken from Sub-Saharan Africa were forced to undergo this brutal procedure. It was painful, dangerous, and often deadly. The reason for this was that in some Muslim courts and wealthy households, eunuchs were considered more trustworthy because they couldn't have families or challenge their masters. These boys were often cut without proper medical care. Many died from infection or bleeding. Those who survived had to live with the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Number 6. African kingdoms took part in the trade. It's easy to assume that outsiders came in and took slaves by force, but the truth is more complicated. In many cases, African kings, chiefs, and local rulers were involved in capturing and selling their own people or rival groups to Arab traders. Slavery was already part of African society before outside traders arrived. But the demand from the Arab world made the problem much worse. Some African kingdoms grew rich by selling slaves. They used the profits to buy goods like salt, horses, or textiles. They also used slaves as a form of currency or tribute. This involvement helped keep the trade going for centuries, even though it brought long-term harm to the continent. Number 5. The trade changed African societies forever. The Sub-Saharan slave trade didn't just take people away. It changed the way African societies worked. Constant warfare broke out between groups competing for control of trade routes or trying to capture more people to sell. Some regions became militarized, with warlords or kings focused only on profiting from the slave trade. This led to long-term instability in many parts of Africa. Communities were destroyed, cultures were lost. Trust between groups broke down. In many ways, the roots of modern conflict in some African countries can be traced back to the pressures and damage caused by centuries of slave trading. Number 4. Slaves were taken as far as India and China. Most people assume the Sub-Saharan slave trade only went as far as the Arab world, but that's not true. Some African slaves were taken all the way to Persia, India, and even China. They worked in royal courts, served as soldiers, or lived in wealthy households. Some even rose to positions of power. In India, for example, there were African-origin rulers like Malik Amber, who became a respected military leader in the 1600s. Despite this, most enslaved people were treated as outsiders and often couldn't pass on their culture or heritage. Over time, their stories were forgotten, and many of their descendants today don't even know their full roots. Number 3. Many slaves never had children. One of the long-term effects of the Sub-Saharan slave trade is that many of the people taken never had children. This happened for a few reasons. First, many male slaves were turned into eunuchs and could no longer reproduce. Second, female slaves, who served as concubines or domestic workers, often didn't have the freedom to form families. And third, many enslaved people died young due to poor living conditions or harsh labor. This meant that, unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which created large African-descended communities in the Americas, the Sub-Saharan slave trade didn't lead to major African populations in the Middle East. African bloodlines were often cut short, and cultural connections were lost. Number 2. The trade continued into the 20th century. Most people think slavery ended in the 1800s, but in some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, the Sub-Saharan slave trade continued well into the 20th century. In places like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Sudan, African slaves were still being bought and sold as recently as the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, Saudi Arabia only officially banned slavery in 1962. Even today, there are reports of slavery-like practices in parts of North Africa. People from Sub-Saharan Africa are still at risk of exploitation, especially migrants and refugees traveling through countries like Libya. So while the trade may be over on paper, its effects haven't fully disappeared. Number 1. The legacy is still with us today. The Sub-Saharan slave trade didn't just harm individuals, it changed the shape of African history. Entire regions were depopulated, cultures were erased, and relationships between African communities and the outside world were damaged. The loss of millions of people over centuries weakened African development and made the continent more vulnerable to colonization later on. Even today, the legacy of this trade can be seen in racial attitudes, poverty levels, and the way African people are viewed in parts of the Arab world. These old wounds haven't fully healed, and they never will. Unless more people learn what really happened and why it matters, the Sub-Saharan slave trade isn't just a side note in history. It's a massive, painful chapter that changed millions of lives and shaped the African continent in deep ways. From long desert journeys to the rise of powerful kingdoms, from the loss of cultures to the silence of forgotten stories, this trade left behind scars that we still live with today. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Let's keep learning, let's keep questioning, and let's make sure the people who suffered in silence are never forgotten again.